Greenfield is very boring, but that goes for most of the amateur supercross, so I'm not going to get too hung up on it. The track is mostly flat and extremely wide with a couple smaller rolled off doubles and a super smooth whoop section. The stadium is very nice looking though. It looks like a coliseum with its large white pillars, but other than that, mostly a plain track and setting. Amherst is very similar to Greenfield in the sense that it really feels like a break-in track. Now there are some slightly different obstacles like on-offs and some taller landings, steeper takeoffs. Everything is still super smooth and there aren't any rhythm sections yet, but this could be a good warm-up track if you want. The stadium is also pretty nice with some buildings in the background and a blimp flying around. Sausalito is a pretty fun track, especially for an amateur supercross layout. It's a typical baseball diamond layout, but has fun rhythm sections and some big lines for the later unlocked ATVs. Not much more to comment on here, just a good fun little track. I said that Concord was a little bit of a standout in the Fury 2 video because of its rainy ambience, and I stand by that. I really enjoy the gray rainy aesthetic here. The track itself has some fun jump lines, but is otherwise a very straightforward layout other than the giant concrete structure in the middle of the stadium. Next up we have Lafayette. I think this track is pretty fun. It has a really nice nighttime skybox, which I really love. It's another pretty standard diamond layout, but it has a split whoop section into an on-off after the first corner, which is definitely a unique track feature. My biggest complaint is that there are a couple spots where you abruptly hit jump faces, but it's not a big deal. Providence I ended up liking a lot, though the ATV I chose was admittedly a little too fast for this track. I hit a couple pretty massive lines and probably could have gone bigger if I locked in. The layout was a lot of fun and has a split whoop section like Lafayette. The only problem I had was that the second triple has a really bad kicker in its face that upsets the ATV, but other than that, it was really well built. Washington is another AM Supercross I really enjoyed. It has lots of split options. It felt like every rhythm had at least 2 good ways of tackling them. There's also a pretty big hit in the final rhythm section that you can get on the late game ATVs. This one could potentially be a personal favorite amateur supercross track of mine. Fairbanks is the final amateur supercross track, and I thought it was a little more involved than the other amateur tracks. It has a double dragon's back, which is fun, and an elevated inside line that is so much faster than going around the outside. You should be taking it every lap. I definitely remember this track standing out more than it actually does, though. I thought it would be one of my favorites, but I found Washington and Providence to be far more enjoyable. Onto the Pro Supercross tracks now. Battle Creek, while not a difficult track by any stretch of the imagination, is definitely a step up from even the hardest AM tracks. I thought the track flowed really well, though there aren't really any lines to link. It is a pretty straightforward track. There is an optional on-off before the triple where you can go around the outside and clear the whole thing, but I always opted to cut down and do the on-off line. I knew I liked Trenton before making this video. It has a really cool layout that takes you under the stadium into a fun little rhythm lane with a couple different options. The finish line section can be a little funky, but when you get it right, it's super satisfying. I did always find myself over jumping the first Supercross triple for some reason. I also really like the nighttime skybox and lit up cauldrons at the top of the pillars. Roanoke has some pretty big hits on it. 2 large Supercross triples, the ability to clear the entire on-off before the finish line, and a massive jump over the first corner. There's also a random bridge in the middle of the stadium that is cartoonishly out of place, but does offer the ability to have a pretty unique downhill whoop section and an uphill triple out of the pit the bridge sits over. Williamsburg is a forgettable track, especially for a Pro SX track. It is very straightforward with pretty rigid jump lanes and not a lot of variety in its sections. This feels like a slightly upscaled AM SX track. Prescott uses a generic Supercross layout, and I had a lot of fun doing laps on it. I could get around nearly the entire track without preloading on the ATV I was using. There is a large double over the first corner, and on a faster ATV I think you could get the triple clean, but I just didn't quite have enough to get it. Getting to Lincoln now, it has a very busy layout that, to me at least, works really well. I loved the big split options that set you up for different rhythm lanes, and the finish line being a tunnel jump was a cool touch. The aesthetic is a little puzzling though. Despite being in a stadium, it is very dark. It has a nighttime ambience, but all the lights are off for some reason. I actually kinda like it. It makes it stand out in a category that doesn't have a whole lot of environmental variety. Ventura, just like Trenton, was a track I always really liked, and still enjoy quite a bit despite using a design philosophy I don't entirely like, which is opting for large jumps and wide open straights, and less rhythm sections or line diversity. I actually kinda struggled to get a good lap because the jumps felt so big. It also has a really cool section that jumps up into a spectator area. Overall, great track in my opinion. I fuck with Kingston heavy. The rhythms are super fun. The turning whoop section under the bridge, while it's strange in terms of track design, I think is a cool touch. The fact it has two bridges and crosses over itself as many times as it does makes this one stand out above the rest. It gives it a layout that isn't really comparable to any of the other courses. I'm going to do all the short tracks in one go. Rockbridge Park is built on a large hillside. You go up it at a bit of an angle, sweeping up into a small flowing rhythm section before snaking back down the hill into a muddy first corner. Caribou Peak is on a frozen pond on top of a hill. It's entirely made of ice, so be mindful of the very little traction you're going to have. Lastly, we have San Jacinto Isles, which is a bayside track with a couple pretty big hits and a twisty section through some of the tropical vegetation. Prospect Springs is just a boring track. Depending on how you play the game, it is the very first track you will experience. It is built in a cool area outlining a small pond with some sprinklers in the middle of it, which I really enjoy. I really like this one. Tioga Valley is built like a little local cross track. It is completely separate from the trails and is in its own little pocket in the valley surrounded by motorhomes and campsites. I love the lights surrounding the track too. It makes me wish there was a nighttime version. Arlington Stream is a combination of trail systems and purpose-built motocross track. I love the water crossings and busted bridge in the last corner. This is actually one of my favorite maps in the whole game. I remember freeriding on it for hours at a time, just exploring and messing around with the train. The surrounding environment is really cool, with the aforementioned train, barns, and a watermill. Really like the vibe of this place. Rockbridge Park is sick. You race up, down, through, and even on top of two large hills using rock and shoddy suspension bridges. There is lots of elevation given its location, and even some mud pits in between some of the jumps and corners. This is the first track that kind of feels like a mess of strung together trails, but to me it feels more like the track existed, and then the trails were connected later. There are a couple places where it might be confusing to follow without a minimap, but it's an otherwise very well put together course. Freeport Harbor, while a really cool location with intriguing set pieces and a rainy, cloudy ambience, is not a very fun track. At least I don't think so. This one really feels like a bunch of strung together trails, and ironically it actually isn't. This track is mostly disconnected from the trail system. I absolutely love this location though, with the wooden bridges and fishing village vibe. I also really like the lighthouse and always thought the statue of the fisherman was really cool. Caribou Peak is an absolute mess of trails. While the snowy ambience is a 10 out of 10, this track just isn't that fun. The things that I do really like about it though have everything to do with the snowy mountainous environment. The big wooden walkways and snow-dusted trees, despite being the coldest place in this whole game, it gives me warm vibes. I love the snowfall too, but it can be a bit much and actually does give me a bit of a headache after a while. Sonora Dunes. I don't really have a lot to say about this one. It's built into sand dunes, similarly to Yucatan Dunes from Fury, but leans more into the natural rolling mounds of sand dunes you would see in real life. Environmentally, it's pretty plain, but the trucks and tents with barbecues and campfires littered around give it some much needed life. San Jacinto Isles is a bonus track you get for finishing the game to 100% completion, and it is crazy. It has massive jumps, but also some tight snaking sections. The location is awesome, being in a dense jungle on a bunch of smaller connecting islands with a river flowing around and through them. There are ancient ruins and monuments from a bygone era that give it a bit of an uneasy feeling, but overall this track is really cool. White Sands Raceway is the first pro national track we have. It's a nice little beachside track. The layout is pretty straightforward and offers far more structure than the AM tracks. The jumps and berms are placed with more rhyme and reason, and there is a more professional presentation overall. I really like this track. Next up, we have Segura Wash. This track was a lot of fun to go back to, though it has a couple things that, while not so bad on this track specifically, later pro national tracks would suffer a bit from, and that's the dug-in feeling that this track has. To build on that, it feels like parts of the track are just dirt half-pipes, and it gives it a bit of a claustrophobic feeling. Other than that, the jumps are smooth and varied, and there are even some smaller rhythm sections thrown in to spice things up. I also think the length of this track is really good. I would argue it and White Sands have near perfect length in their layouts. Anaconda Run snakes through a dense get it? Snakes? Through a dense jungle, and while it looks great and for the most part has a really good fun layout and flowing jumps and hills, it has a couple places where that dirt halfpipe thing I talked about on Segura Wash comes in. On this track, there are spots where the layout feels like these banks are a part of the course, but if you get on them too much, they will just knock you around or take you out completely if you go too far up the slope. For the most part, this shouldn't be a problem, but I remember in my playthrough I would get forced into some of those lines by bots, and it was a bit frustrating to deal with. Palisades Basin. This was a point in recording where I started using the Ravaged Talon Orange exclusively. This track is awesome. It has tons of elevation, and most of it is used for big step-ups, step-downs, and massive hits over entire hillsides. I also see an attempt to add some roughness to the track, which is an extremely ambitious idea given when the game came out. I also absolutely love the setting with its discolored pine trees, massive wooden walkways and cabins. It feels like a location frozen in mid to late autumn. The length of the track is a little much. I ran a 2:19 with some mistakes, of course, and while that's not the most ridiculous lap ever, it's roughly what a fast amateur runs around Washougal, it stacks up quickly when doing the longer 5-lap races in the career mode. Newcastle Landing was kinda forgettable for me. The layout didn't really feel like anything special, and there are a couple of parts that just felt a little poorly thought out. A massive flatland and a couple spots where you kind of just get dumped into berms at weird angles that can cause a crash in a way that feels undeserving. I really love the windmills scattered around the place. It gives the otherwise pretty generic landscape a bit more pop. I really like Hawthorne Mills for its setting. I'm a bit of a sucker for industrial-esque areas, and a logging mill fits that criteria pretty well. I've always thought it was strange that the track was called Hawthorne Mills, because the name on the buildings is Hilterbrand. Maybe that was the early name of the track? I don't know. In terms of the track itself, not really a lot to say. Kind of the same thing as Newcastle, but there aren't any standout annoyances for me, and honestly I actually had quite a bit of fun on this track. I just couldn't really give a standout track feature. It's all in the environmental details. Alpine Skyway is one of those tracks that just hits different, and that's very important because it has a pretty long lap. Despite having a long lap, I never felt lost or like I was forgetting where I was. The track is very easy to read and flows absolutely effortlessly, whether it's in the more open jumping sections or the narrow twisting bits. I love the snowy environment too, though other than the frozen pond with the little wooden shack, it's unfortunately a pretty barren landscape. Last up, we have Monterey Trail, and I don't really have anything to say about this track. It's not bad, it just doesn't stick out at all in terms of track design, and environmentally, it's another mostly empty birch forest.